The U.S. has the highest prison population in the world, some of them subjected to lengthy sentences for relatively minor crimes. So does America's lock 'em up and throw away the key attitude to crime and punishment really work? You're watching Inside Story Americas from Washington. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu. The prison population in the United States has surged over the past 3 decades. Although there's been a slight reduction in the past year, more than 2 million people are incarcerated, either in prison or in jail awaiting trial. 743 Americans are incarcerated per 100,000 of population. That means the U.S. is the highest rate of imprisonment in the world. In fact, no other country approaches America's figures. One explanation for the boom in the prison population is the mandatory sentencing imposed for drug offenses and the tough-on-crime attitude that's prevailed since the 1980s. But it's the length of the sentences that truly distinguishes American prison policy. Some prisoners are locked up for life, literally. Many receive harsh sentences for non-violent crime. The long sentences lead to overcrowding, which in turn leads to the building of new jails. Nearly 40% of America's prison population is African American. That's despite blacks making up only 12% of the total U.S. population. In fact, a black male is 7 times more likely to be imprisoned than a white male. More and more of the prison population are aging as long sentences are imposed. 8% are over the age of 55. This increases the burden for providing healthcare and geriatric services. And many prisoners report suffering from mental health issues and drug addiction. In California alone, it's believed around 50% of inmates need mental health treatment. So why does the United States have the highest rate of documented incarceration in the world? And does this policy work, or is it a rehabilitation policy a better way? To answer this, we're joined from New York by Larry White, who's a community advocate for Fortune Society, a group which promotes alternatives to incarceration. Larry himself spent more than 30 years behind bars. Tracey Velasquez is here with me in the studio. She's the executive director of the Justice Policy Institute. And we're also joined by Charlie Sullivan from Citizens United for Rehabilitation of Errants, also known as CURE. Welcome to all of you to the program. We look at those figures, they're very sobering figures. The United States has something like 5% of the world's population, but when we look at its prison population, it has a quarter of the world's prison population. I mean, let's try and put this into some kind of perspective. As we reported there, the United States has the highest documented incarceration rate in the world, with 743 people in prisons and jails for every 100,000 residents. Now, Rwanda comes second with 595 per 100,000 behind bars. Russia is third with 568 per 100,000 imprisoned. China only has figures for prisoners who've been sentenced, with 122 inmates for every 100,000 people. That's 71st on the list. But even if the estimated number of people imprisoned but awaiting trial are added, the proportional figures are still lower than the United States. Tracey Velasquez, why the huge number in the U.S.?
There's a number of reasons, most having to do with the way we've changed policies over the past 3 decades. We sentence people longer through mandatory minimums, 3 strikes laws. We have seen a huge increase in the number of people incarcerated for drug offenses in this country. And we also use prison as a sentence more than most other countries. Other countries will find other ways to hold people accountable. The U.S. chooses prison more than any other country.
Larry White in New York, you've described the imprisonment of people in the United States as the new slavery. Explain that one.
Well, when you look at the history of the predominant number of people who are going to prison in the United States, you'll find they are people of color. When you look at right after slavery, and they passed the 13th Amendment. The 13th Amendment says there shall be no slavery except for those who are convicted of a serious crime. What has happened since that time that the 13th Amendment came into effect and people in slavery was ended, we find that there's a great deal of African American and Latino men and people of color generally who have been going into our prison system and convicted of serious crimes. What that means what that means, of course, is that what that means, of course, is that once you're convicted of a crime in the United States, what we find would have collateral consequences. If you're sentenced to say like 5 to 10 years, you can go to jail and you serve the whole 10 years and come out with the notion of improving your life and living a law-abiding life. What you'll find is that the opportunities to improve your life are practically nil. You have what they call collateral consequences of having been convicted of a crime and served time. So you'll find that when you apply for a job, for employment, for housing, even for college, you have to notate whether or not you've been convicted of a crime. If you've been convicted of a crime, you generally fall to the bottom of that list. I say it's slavery because prison has become the modern day slavery. There's a whole cast of people we have in this country who have been convicted of crime and have what I call a mark of the beast. Once you have that conviction, it stops all your life chances have been reduced.
Okay.
Your abilities to improve the quality of your life, you know.
All right, great. Let's come up to Charlie Sullivan here with me in the studio. Larry talks there about collateral consequences of people still being punished even after they've served their sentences and go out into the world. They can't get jobs. They can't basically reincorporate into the communities they came from. To what extent does the problem start even before they go to prison? When we look at the communities they come from, most of the prison population, and there are some who would say, look, if the high number of Hispanics and blacks are in prison, well, it's because a high number of blacks and Hispanics commit crimes.
Well, I think statistically that is not true. That we see that the crime rate is pretty much across the board. It's just that the people of color are actually incarcerated more. That's where the police presence is, usually in the inner city. So you have more people going arrested and going to prison, but the crime rate, I think, statistically is about the same across the board. Also, we started in Texas, and there's an old saying among the prisoners in Texas that you're guilty until proven rich, and I think that's true. I think that usually people of white people are able to hire a better attorney, or even many people of color, we end up with a court-appointed attorney. And so you're able to, in a sense, buy your way out of the system if you are in the majority, and that being a white person.
Tracey, to what extent has the mandatory sentencing for drug offenders, also the easy availability of guns, to what extent does that have to do with the high prison population?
Well, I wanted to sort of also tag a little bit on to what Charlie was saying too first, and that was around the issue of the communities of color and the way that the criminal justice system treats them, really going all the way back to when they're kids. If you look at the schools they go to, the schools that have a lot of police in them, the schools where children tend to get a second chance by having caring adults who
So that's
steer
what I was
them
trying to
right.
make. Those collateral
Right.
consequences start
Right.
before they go
They
to
start
prison.
before even then, and it starts to how different children are treated in different communities. That leads to their being involved in the justice system. And I just wanted to point out that it's how kids get pushed out of schools. They get pushed into sort of what's become known as the school to prison pipeline is a big piece of it too. In terms of the drug sentences, getting back to Charlie's point about and your point about are there different rates of offenses, of different rates of crime, we know from data, national data, that around drug use, that people use drugs at roughly the same rate for different ethnicities and different races. And yet, the number of African Americans and Latinos who end up in prison for drug charges is much higher. Obviously, we don't have data on all other sorts of offenses, but when you just look at drugs, you can clearly see that the way that we have treated drugs and criminalized addiction really has impacted some communities more than others.
Okay. Larry White, what is the connection between the rising prison population and the current economic downturn that we're experiencing right now?
I don't know the degree to which the prison population, has a direct effect on economy in this particular country. I am aware that You know, there seems to be two trends in terms of prisons that's taking place in the United States. There's the growth of the private prisons, you know, and of course they raise their own particular issues why prisons should be private institutions and how they address immigration issues and all of that. But you also find that
I want to get to that
of,
issue. Larry, I want to get to that issue of private prisons in just a moment. But what I was looking at is, you know, are there more people committing crimes right now because there are more people jobless, because the economy has taken a downturn?
Well, there's always a connection between economic conditions and crime itself. Downward turn economics is crime generative. I mean, these are factors that lead to crime. When people find themselves in desperate straits, they do desperate things, you know, and that leads to crime. So there's always a connection between the economy and crime, sure.
Although the figures actually show overall that violent crime and property crime are down over the past, well, they've been down for a while. So it is kind of a little bit confusing, and it may be having to do with who's impacted more than others. I mean, sort of the upside of, if there is an upside to the economic downturn, is that states and local governments are starting to look at the high cost of incarceration and look at how to reduce incarceration because it is so expensive. You
know, interesting you say that, because from 2008 to now, there has been less violent crime. In fact, violent crime has dropped by something like 25%. Mm-hmm.
Well, I think, too, that there is some hope, and I think programs like Fortune Society has been around for many, many years in providing help, the reentry movement, where it used to be, and Larry can talk about, where you would come out of prison with a few dollars and really no one to meet you at the gate. Today, there is a lot of movement to help people when they return back to society. So I think these movements, and there is, besides the reentry movement, as Tracey says, there is less incarceration, there's a move for alternatives, and so we're seeing I think the reason that the crime rate is down in the midst of this high unemployment is that there is a movement going on, a prison reform movement that includes reentry, includes a decrease in the prisoner population, includes evidence-based programs, which I think are very important, things that work, we're seeing now. And we're utilizing them. I mean, communities from New York City across the country are utilizing. Here in Washington, I was at Saturday at a program over in the southeast Washington, where there are very, very many former prisoners there, and they had a reentry day where they was thanking all the people who are going the extra mile to help people when they come back to the prison. They even honored, I thought it was so beautiful, they honored a barber who gave free haircuts to prisoners when they were coming back. I thought that's wonderful. People were volunteering. In other words, today, I think, and it has had an impact on the crime rate, that people are doing things to help the offender when they come back into the community.
Right. There is one other reason why the number of prisoners in the United States has decreased, and that is the whole question of overcrowding. I want to ask you about this, Tracey. In May 2010, the United States Supreme Court ruled that California prisoners, or California prisons rather, were so overcrowded that they had to reduce the number of prisoners in California prisoners. Now, to what extent has that changed the number of prisoners?
Well, what's interesting in California is the model that they've used. Instead of what I would have liked them to see is really address why so many people are incarcerated. They're sort of, you know, moving the pieces around on the board. They're moving more people back to their county jails rather from the state system, without really addressing, I think, some of the root causes of why there's so many people in prison in California. Their sentencing, the fact that places like the LA County Jail hold so many people pre-trial and they never get a chance to be adequately defended. You know, obviously there's some advantages to moving people locally. They maybe are closer to family and jobs, and and that might help with their reentry. But you know, there's also some concern. Some of these counties just are not able to handle it. Some have talked about charging prisoners room and board. And I think, as we started to talk about a little bit, you know, to what extent is our private prisons somehow going to be able to wedge themselves into this issue to address over-incarceration?
Yeah, one of the arguments used in that case I was talking about was whether overcrowding in prisons violates the constitutional ban on cruel and unusual punishment. Now, that could be used across the country, couldn't it?
Yeah.
That certainly, yeah. And you talked earlier about private prisons, and I think that the whole, and that is a threat to this reentry movement, or to a decrease in the prisoner population, because as Larry pointed out too, I think the private prison movement is to keep more and more people locked up.
Okay, well, let's just take a look at the private prisoner situation here in the private prison situation here in the United States. Now, there are more than 129,000 people who were in private prisons in 2009. That's compared to 87,000 in 2000. That's a 37% increase. Now, 8% of prisoners in the U.S. are now held in private facilities. And in 2010, private prison companies spent more than $2 million in campaign funding for candidates at state level. That's a 165% rise from 2002. They're also spending millions more lobbying legislators. Larry White, I want to address this to you. You know, we found that in one case, one of the biggest private prison companies in the United States, a company known as Correctional Corporation, it smacked of corruption in the way this company was set up, because it was one of the co-founders was actually the chairman of the Tennessee Republican Party, and he put forward this plan to build these private prisons, and now we have this burgeoning industry, which some people refer to as the prison industrial complex.
Prisons, you know, prisons are equated with money today. You know, I mean, when you look at the kind of country that we live in a capitalist society, you know, and so they look at any booming industry here as a way of making money. You know, I really, you know, for me to answer all these questions, we really got to go to the root problem of why do we select prisons to solve most of the problems that we call criminal. You know, crime is socially defined. People define what a crime is. How we approach crime really boils down to how this country feels about punishment. You know, we try to punish every particular act that we feel is wrong. And so we load people up into our prison systems. It's hard for people to even begin to think what kind of society we have if we didn't have any prisons at all. There are a number of ways we can deal with crime without locking them up. The rise in alternative to incarceration programs shows that. In one sense, prisons are on a decline, and on the other sense, they're going up. Private prisons is really trying to pull prisons back into the whole thing, because people are looking for various ways of dealing with crime without sending them to prison.
Yeah, and there is the profit motive as well. I mean, let's take a look at this excerpt from the 2005 annual report of the Corrections Corporation of America, the one that I was talking about, which is the biggest private prison company in the U.S. And I'm quoting here from the report. It says the demand for our facilities and services could be adversely affected by the relaxation of enforcement efforts, leniency in conviction and sentencing practices. Any changes with respect to drugs and controlled substances or illegal immigration could affect the number of persons arrested, convicted, and sentenced, thereby potentially reducing demand for correctional facilities to house them. And of course, what it also reduces is the amount of money we're going to put in our pockets at the end of the financial year. So, yeah. I mean, this is it's cynical, isn't it, the way they look at this?
And let me just point out our organization.
I'll come to you in a moment, Larry.
Yeah, I just want to make the point that we're not against privatization per se in regard to connected with prisoners. We feel the private sector ought to provide employable skills, good jobs and good wages. And I would even see where prisoners could belong to unions, so that when they would come out, they would be able to go to the union hall and be able to have a job, et cetera. So we're not necessarily saying all privatization is wrong.
Yeah, but what this is saying is
they shouldn't run the prisons.
Yeah, but what this is saying is, hey, you guys ought to imprison more people, otherwise.
Right. We're totally opposed to that. Yeah. But the private sector has a role in regard to providing employable skills. And there are some very good programs. I don't know if they're in New York, but certainly in a lot of places. Usually the unions are very much against it. We've got to get the unions on board. The unions have been missing in the reentry movement, in my opinion.
I think it's a fine line, though.
It's a fine line,
between prisoners, people who are incarcerated, being used for basically slave labor at 10 cents
Well, we're
an
not
hour.
talking about slave labor, and
it
could be. The potential is there. But I think employable skills, we're talking about where the private sector can go in and train prisoners. And I've served.
But I'm wondering, and Tracey, you may be able to address this. What is the motivation for these companies to unionize their prisoners, for instance? Because they are using slave labor right now, and they're making a lot of money out of it.
Well, it's interesting because there is definitely a need for people to leave, who are incarcerated, to leave with the skills to be successful on the outside. Right. That means education. That means job skills. But when it becomes basically like a labor camp, that's when we have concerns, when it's really just picking up trash. Okay. So, and in terms of the private prisons, what we've seen is that, you know, they will make a buck any way they can. I mean, they make a buck over the telephones. They make a buck on the commissary. Any money that they can extract from prisoners or make from prisoners helps their bottom line. Florida's looking again to privatize 29 prisons. We just had a report come out from the Institute of Money and State Politics. The private prison spent over almost $1 million just in 2010 alone on political campaigns in Florida, where they're looking at privatizing a large percentage.
Has the Florida effort been blocked by the courts, though?
Well, there's a new bill in their Senate right now, which is waiting to be heard on the Senate floor, that would revive that and would again put forth legislation to privatize 29 prisons in Florida.
Okay. Let's go to Larry White. Larry, you wanted to say something.
Yeah, you were talking about how private prisons were talking about passing more laws and procedures that would essentially shunt people into the prison system. You know, I think that what we really got to look at, you know, a lot of us seem to think that prisons really solve problems. There's a deep and abiding belief in a whole lot of people, even so-called liberals, that prisons solve problems. You know, I mean, what we've got to realize is this. Listen, we have to diminish the use of punishment, all right, and increase the use of evidence-based programs that shows changes in a person's behavior and cognitive thinking, and so that it leads to law-abiding conduct. Those kind of things can be best addressed in the community. I mean, our highest academics in this country tell us that. I don't know why we keep locking into the fact that prisons can help people. You know, that we send people to rehabilitate them. You know, I mean, that's that traditional approach. A person commits a crime, and what they say, oh, that person is evil, that person is wrong. People don't live in a vacuum, all right? They live in a world. And in that world, there are social, economic, and political consequences. You know, these are the things that surround people and that they react to. They shape people's behavior and how they think about certain things. We don't address that. We just address the individual. We don't address the social conditions in which they live in. You know? That's what prison does. Prison doesn't address the economic or the social or the surrounding circumstances that really have a great deal to do with whether a person goes to jail or not, or whether they commit a crime or not. People just don't commit a crime because it's something they thought last night.
Charlie, where does reform start? I mean, you know, we've got a serious problem here in the United States, and it doesn't even feature on anybody's election agenda.
Yes.
Not even the President of the United States has been talking about it.
Right. I mean, I think particularly, and it's strange, we had a Republican governor in Mississippi actually do some very controversial pardons. He really brought clemency. Has always been a role historically in this country, and he's brought it back.
That's Haley Barbour pardoning.
Right, Haley Barbour. I think the only thing President Obama has pardoned is turkeys, really, when you get right down to it. I haven't seen, I think it's very minor crimes, one or two people or whatever. So he really has not been a friend in regard to clemency. So I think it's uphill. I think it's also bipartisan. Let me say, too, I think Larry, and I can certainly sympathize, but he's talking about being a prison abolitionist. Yeah. I think I'm a prison reformer. Okay. But I can certainly sympathize with what he's saying. But I feel we have 2.3 million people in prison,
Right.
and we ought to be providing employable skills, ought to be teaching them how to use computers.
Okay, Charlie, we're going
etc.
to have to leave it there. We've run out of time. Thanks to all of you for joining us. And that is it from the team here in Washington, D.C. for now. But of course, we want to hear from you. Tell us what stories you think we should be covering. Send your ideas directly to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. And don't forget to follow us on Facebook and Twitter.